The gravity of sin. The estate of Blackwood stood less like a home and more like a decaying monument to a singular monstrous ego. It was a sprawling Gothic ulcer on the landscape, a place where the fog from the moors did not drift in, but seemed to be actively exhaled by the damp floorboards, as though the house had grown weary of containing what lived within. The stones wept condensation in the mornings. The beams groaned at night with the sound of something remembering. The portraits in the hall did not depict ancestors. They depicted versions of Silas in different costumes, different decades, the same hollow eyes staring out from each gilt frame, surveying his harvest. But the true chill in the air did not come from the weather. It radiated from the patriarch, a cold front that had its own barometric pressure, its own weather system of dread. His name was Silas. To the world outside, he was a devout man, a pillar of the community who quoted scripture with the practiced cadence of a televangelist, each verse deployed like a coin dropped into a collection plate that only he was permitted to empty. To us, his wife, his brother, his children, he was a parasite wrapped in human skin, a demiurgic architect of a false cosmos who had demanded our worship to sustain the illusion of his own divinity. He did not merely rule the house. He rewrote the physics of it. I am Julian, the son whose spirit he tried to dismantle with the patience of an entomologist pinning a specimen. For decades, my existence and that of my sister Clara was a utilitarian equation. We were not children. We were raw materials to be refined, harvested, and discarded. Silas did not hoard wealth the way lesser men hoard wealth. He weaponized it. He had studied the alchemy of terror with surgical precision, learning that a panicked mind cannot mount a rebellion, that a starving spirit cannot philosophize, that a child in perpetual financial freefall becomes too exhausted to recognize the hand that is pushing him. He engineered our crises the way a warden rations water to a starving prison. The money meant for my food would vanish on the eve of the grocery run, justified by a twisted theology that claimed my hunger was a lack of faith, while he dined on the best cuts of beef and washed them down with aged whiskey. I remember standing in the pantry at 14, my hands shaking from a hunger that had become a permanent tenet of my body, listening to him laugh in the dining room about a sermon he had heard on suffering. The laughter was the worst of it. The laughter told you that the cruelty was not incidental. It was the entertainment. When the psychological siege left me shaking in sterile doctors' offices, battling the wreckage of the anxiety and depression he had cultivated like a gardener tending poisonous orchids, Silas felt no pity. He felt the irritation of a factory owner whose machinery is making an inconvenient noise. To acknowledge my suffering would mean acknowledging that I existed as a separate being with intrinsic worth, and his ego was incapable of that computation. I learned, before I learned to read, that my tears were a defect in the product. I learned to swallow them. I learned to swallow everything until the swallowing itself became a sound the house remembered. Every 6 months, a new automobile appeared in the drive, a gleaming chariot of chrome and steel, purchased with the sleep we were denied. The leather seats were upholstered with my insomnia. The deed to the expanding estate was signed in the ink of Clara's delegitimized tears. He forged these hollow idols to insulate himself from the void that was slowly recognizing him. Each new acquisition, a pagan altar raised against the silence that was coming for him. We were not family. We were the livestock whose lean muscle financed the feast. We were, as I came to understand it, insects crushed against the windshield of his relentless ambition. And the stain we left behind was merely an irritation he would wash away at the next station. My mother, Beatrice, was a quieter, more insidious breed of monster. She was the curator of the lie, the high priestess of the delusion, a covert narcissist whose entire identity was constructed around the maintenance of the facade. When Silas raged or stole, Beatrice would smooth her skirts and murmur that we did not understand the burden of greatness. She enforced the blasphemous doctrine that the cosmos had been spun into existence strictly to cater to Silas's appetite. She benefited from the throne she defended. She was the martyr queen who received her dividends in status and proximity to power. Then there was Uncle Vernon, the complicit shadow who sat in the corner drinking Silas's liquor and nodding along to the delusions, receiving his own small portion of the stolen harvest in exchange for his silence. A silent witness to the slaughter of our souls, growing fat on the scraps of our devouring. Silas's masterpiece was Clara. He did not merely manipulate her. He waged epistemological warfare against her, systematically dismantling her capacity to perceive reality so that he could replace it with his own. He drained her finances, her time, her sanity, using her as a blunt instrument to destroy anyone who opposed him. By her 30th year, she could no longer trust her own memory of a conversation she had completed 5 minutes prior. He had made her the unreliable narrator of her own life. He felt no remorse. Morality was the consolation of the weak. He believed he sat at the right hand of the Almighty, never comprehending that he had long since mistaken his own reflection for the face of God. But Silas was blind to the true nature of the Almighty. God is not a man on a throne granting favors to hypocrites. God is the underlying fabric of existence, the physics, the mathematics, the silent and inexorable order that holds the stars in their courses and the atoms in their dance. The universe is infinitely patient, but it is not a fool. For 8 decades, it had extended Silas credit, allowing him to exist within the protective membrane of natural law. It waited with the patience of geology for him to turn away from his evil, to exhibit a single molecule of humility, to acknowledge one creature besides himself. He never did. And so in his 82nd year the universe called in the debt. The universal laws that had protected him, that had permitted his parasitism to function, began to withdraw their consent. The onset was subtle, a glitch in the matrix of reality. It was a cold November evening when the first law revoked its covenant. Silas sat in his grand oak chair, holding a crystal glass of whiskey, the same ritual with which he had toasted the accumulation of his empire. He raised it to his lips, but the liquid defied him. It did not pour, it climbed. The whiskey defied gravity, crawling up the sides of the glass like a living thing, repelled by the proximity of his mouth. It hovered in a trembling sphere, refusing to touch him. Silas slammed the glass down, purple-faced with rage. He cursed the servants, the quality of the crystal, the alignment of the planets. He could not conceive that the universe itself was rejecting his biology. The breakdown escalated rapidly. It was not just gravity, it was physics. It was causality itself. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in his presence thinned. It was not that he could not breathe. It was that the air molecules refused to engage with him. Oxygen rushed around his form like water around a stone, leaving a vacuum of suffocation against his skin. He gasped, his lungs working frantically, but the gas exchange failed. The air treated him as if he were not matter but a void to be bypassed, a logical error in the equation of life. His cathedral of lies began to dissolve. When Silas opened his mouth to manipulate, to spin his webs of deceit, the sound that came out was guttural and wrong. His vocal cords vibrated, but the air refused to carry the frequency. His words dropped to the floor with wet thuds, inarticulate noises that sounded like tearing meat. He tried to quote scripture, and the noise was the static of a dead channel. The universe had revoked his license to speak. It would no longer transmit his poison. Then came the severance. Narcissists require enablers. They require a reflection to validate their existence. Beatrice, seeing his distress, rushed to him with a damp cloth. But as she reached out to wipe his brow, her hand passed through his skin. It was a horror of absolute disconnection. There was no resistance, no warmth, only a cold, empty air where her husband of 50 years should have been. Beatrice screamed, jerking her hand back as if she had touched a flame. Silas was becoming intangible to the very people he had enslaved. The atomic cohesion that binds humans together in a social and physical covenant had been severed. He was untethering from the human race. Uncle Vernon tried to grab him, to anchor him, but his grasp closed on nothing but the fabric of the chair. Silas drifted, not upward like a balloon, but outward in all directions, his edges blurring. He looked like a smudge of dirty ink bleeding across the painting of the room. "Help me!" Silas tried to scream, but the air swallowed the sound before it left his throat. He did not understand. He thought it was a test, a temporary trial visited upon the faithful. He did not feel the terror of a penitent man. He felt the fury of a king whose subjects have inexplicably vanished. He looked at Clara with eyes that bulged with hatred, demanding she fix this, demanding she serve him as she had always served him. But the universe was not finished. The climax of his cosmic eviction occurred on the winter solstice. The longest night of the year, the night the old religions reserved for the reckoning of accounts. The geometry of the library began to corrode. The corners of the ceiling bent inward at non-Euclidean angles, the laws of mathematics collapsing in upon themselves. The walls breathed. The temperature did not drop. Temperature itself became a memory the room was struggling to recall. The grandfather clock that had kept the time of 3 generations of Blackwood patriarchs ceased its ticking, then began to tick backwards, each click a small surrender of stolen years. The shadows detached from the furniture. They were not merely absences of light. They were the accumulated weight of his sin given a body to wear. They poured up from beneath the floorboards like oil from a wound, viscous and patient, slow as the geology that had finally come for him. As they rose, they took their shapes, and the shapes were obscene because they were familiar. I saw the silhouette of every cousin he had bankrupted, every employee he had broken, every woman whose name he had used like a coin to be spent. The shadows had eyes, too many of them, arranged in spirals like the eyes of a peacock's tail, and each eye was a different color, and each color was a year of someone's stolen life. Their limbs articulated wrong joints bending in directions that geometry forbade. They smelled of cold pennies and burnt hair, and the inside of an empty refrigerator at 3 in the morning. One of them moved forward. It was larger than the others. It walked on its knees, which is to say it did not walk at all but flowed, its body assembling and disassembling itself with each forward motion. It had the rough shape of a man, but where the face should have been there was a mirror, black, polished, depthless, and in the mirror Silas saw himself at every age he had ever been. The boy who had drowned the family dog for sport, the young man who had seduced his brother's fiancée and then mocked her for crying, the patriarch who had stolen a child's lunch money and called it tithing. Every version of him, watching every version of him, with the patience of something that had been assembling these reflections for 82 years, and had finally completed the gallery. The lead shadow leaned close to my father. It did not have a mouth, but it spoke, and the speaking was not sound. It was a pressure inside the bones of every person in that room. Beatrice clutched her ears. Clara folded forward as though struck. Uncle Vernon vomited onto his own shoes. Silas, the shadow said, and the word was every name he had ever refused to learn. You believed the cosmos was a marketplace and you the only buyer. You believed the meek would inherit nothing and the cruel would inherit forever. Here then, the new arithmetic. The cosmic scales have finally tilted to us, to the ones beneath the floorboards, to the abyss that has counted every coin and every tear. To every narcissist still feeding, every psychopath still smiling, every bully still laughing at the small and the broken, we are the interest that has accrued. We are the foreclosure. We are the silent partner who has waited 82 years to call the meeting. You taught your children they were insects. We have come to teach you the patience of the spider. Silas, now a ghost in his own body, finally felt fear. But it was not the fear of God. It was the terror of a predator realizing he has become the prey. I command you, he tried to roar, but his voice was a wet wheeze. I am the master. You exist to serve me. The shadow with the mirror face tilted its head, and in the mirror every reflection of Silas began to laugh in unison, laughed at him, the way he had laughed at me in the pantry at 14. The laughter was the worst of it. The laughter told him that the cruelty was not incidental. It was the entertainment. The other shadows surged. They flowed toward him, bypassing the friction of the floor. They did not burn him, they unmade him. The floor beneath his chair dissolved, revealing a pit of absolute blackness, the abyss of a universe that had finally acknowledged his true nature. It was a place devoid of love, devoid of light, devoid of God. It was the exact reflection of his own soul, and he was being handed the mirror at last. With a sound like the snapping of a billion iron cables, the shadows latched on. They were not made of flesh, but of raw, consuming void. They pierced him with hooks forged from his own regrets. The hooks went in through his eyes, his palms, the soft hollow of his throat where his lies had nested for 82 years. Me! He shrieked, and this sound was finally audible because it was the scream of pure ego, the only truth he had ever spoken. You cannot do this to me. The shadows surged again. Their many hands sank deep into his chest, ripping away the elegant veneer of the patriarch to reveal the rotting parasite beneath. They pulled with the gravity of a dying star. The heavy oak chair splintered into dust, unable to withstand the force of the retrieval. Silas was ripped from the physical plane. He was dragged down, his body elongating and distorting as it breached the event horizon, stretched across an infinity of regret. His screams were cut off instantly, swallowed by the cold silent vacuum of the abyss. But before the hole closed, the lead shadow turned its mirror face once more toward the room, and I felt its pressure inside my ribs. Tell them, it said. Tell every tyrant in every house that calls itself a home. The accounting has begun. The hole in the floor snapped shut with a thunderclap that shook the foundations of Blackwood. The air rushed back into the room, sweet and breathable, heavy with the scent of ozone and rain. The universe had corrected itself. The loan had defaulted, and the collateral had been seized. I stood in the doorway, feeling the phantom weight of 1,000 panic attacks begin to lift. Clara exhaled, a sob of pure relief escaping her lips. Uncle Vernon stared at the empty space where the chair had been, his face pale, his complicity finally burned away by the reality of what he had enabled. Beatrice remained on her knees, staring at her hands, still feeling the ghost of where she had failed to touch him. She was whispering prayers to a God that had long since left the room. For the first time, the house was silent. No demands. No rage. No theft. The parasite was gone. He had been weighed in the balance, found wanting, and the gravity of his own sins had pulled him down into the dark. And yet, as I stood in that impossible silence, I felt the estate settle its deed upon my shoulders like a mantle of cold iron. I breathed the ozone-sweet air, and for one splintered moment I understood the precise geometry of the room with a clarity I had never possessed. I looked at Clara's weeping, and somewhere beneath my relief, a whisper of irritation stirred, thin as a hairline crack in crystal, but unmistakable. The throne was empty. Blackwood had a new patriarch, and the shadow's words still pressed against my ribs like a second heartbeat. The accounting has begun. Nature, I remembered, abhors a vacuum, and somewhere beneath the floorboards, the spider was already counting.